Welcome to The Backstory, a podcast from the North Dakota News Cooperative that takes an in-depth look at the stories we're reporting for you. I'm Sabrina Halverson, CEO of the North Dakota News Cooperative. Joining me is Michael Standaert, our lead reporter. All right, Michael, the story we're talking about this week was headlined Roots Matter for Award-Winning Regenerative Ranch Family. And this one really highlights some work that cattle producers are doing to improve the quality of soil and things here around North Dakota. Tell me about this one specifically.
Yeah, so this was about the Maddock family up in Maddock on the Drift Prairie up kind of near Devil's Lake there. I This was the first time I'd seen this award here in North Dakota, but it's been going on for 10 years. And I when I see something like that, that's like, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't heard of that. That usually piques my interest, and then I'll look into it. And if I haven't heard about it, that means probably quite a few other people hadn't heard about it either. So I was looking into the award itself, and then the work that this ranch family is doing up on its acreage up in Maddock. Um, and yeah, they've been able to, restore the land that they were farming it for a while. Um, Lots of barren spots were appearing. The soil was degrading. They didn't really have many other options to turn to because their crops were, not as productive, before. So they turned to cattle out of necessity, and then, on land that's, becoming degraded, they saw the need to turn to regenerative farming to help heal it. And Brian Maddock had gone to some courses and learn more about this, I think, back in the 90s, and then just started to use those processes on his land to help regenerate the land.
And they won an award for that.
They won the Aldo Leopold Conservation Award, which is an award that's been around since 2003. Was the first award out in Colorado, but this is from the Sand County Foundation, which was developed after conservationist Aldo Leopold had passed away. He wrote this book called the Sand County Almanac. I had read this book, I don't know, probably 1999 or so. It's a long time ago, and heard about the award and talked to them about what they're looking for. And they're one of the things that they mentioned was, it's not just about conservation, but people kind of turning and using the land, but also being profitable in doing it. So they're both being profitable, but they're also regenerating and conserving at the same time. So it's many factors at play.
When we talk about regenerative ag and what they're doing, what kinds of things are they actually doing out there?
So at the Maddock family, they put hay bales out on some of these really degraded spots, and then the cattle will naturally go to those spots, and they'll fertilize them, they'll eat the grass, they'll trample that area because that area has been kind of compacted already. By trampling that area and kind of breaking it up and getting their nutrients from their waste into the ground and breaking it up, that helps feed that soil, feed the microbes in that soil. And from what they've done, they can see, where they put these bales and where the cattle go. It'll just sprout up in the spring and be totally green at that spot where, in the years before it hadn't been at all. It'd been just kind of a brown, dry, or even kind of a salted spot. I was up on the land, and there's some spots where they had put things out to try to regenerate those spots. And it's either hilltops that were not good cropland anyway, or it's kind of lower areas where maybe salt had kind of silted in, or kind of percolated up. And by doing this, they'll rotate the cattle. They'll have a rotational process. They'll bring the cattle onto one paddock for a while. The cattle will, graze there and eat the grass. And I was asking, I was like, so I was talking more with the son, Travis. I was like, well, how do you get them from one paddock to the other? Do you have to like go out there and kind of drive them? And it's like, no, they naturally want, once they open up a paddock, they naturally want to go to that paddock because it's fresh grass, it's grass they haven't been in for a while. They're drawn to that new grass. So they'll move them around, and cattle will pretty much go into that new paddock once they open it up. They'll rush in. So they said, they really don't have to do much as far as urging the cattle onto a new paddock. So I guess the biggest part is, I guess, fencing and then getting your water infrastructure right, getting that in to make sure the water infrastructure is set up because you'll need to have water on each paddock. And from what I've seen in other regenerative ranches like this, they might have a kind of a almost like a spoke system. So like you'll have water at the center of four paddocks, and you're able to get that water once that new paddock opens up on one side of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And it's really interesting because it's easy for people who don't know a lot about ranching or farming to look at the land that's being used and to see it kind of barren or to see the animals, chewing up the grass and that kind of thing and not understand how that ecosystem works because there are a lot of cases like this where cattle are used to actually make the land better. And it sounds like that's what the Maddock family is doing with their ranch and using that cattle and the way that they're moving it around their land and, regrowing the grass in some areas. And like you said, even the cattle waste can be very beneficial, putting some of that nutrients and microbes back into the soil.
Yeah, no, that waste is kind of gold for
Yeah.
for regenerating soil. So, I was asking about why don't, more conventional farmers just allow cattle to come out on their lands, and that, Travis was saying that some do this, but it, it has to make sense for each farmer. And like,
Yeah.
if the fencing is not right, it might not work. And I think a lot of people would like to see more of it because it would, their hooves will, the hooves will kind of help break up some of the ground into, stuff like that,
Yeah.
and get their manure and that into the soil. But it's, these practices were the practices that were, 100, 200 years ago. The cattle would all go out on these lands. But now we've gotten away from that with
Yeah.
large scale industrial conventional agriculture where you don't really have that process. People have turned to the synthetic inputs to do that. And it's kind of degraded the soils in a lot of spots. I mean, some soils is still doing good with those processes, but there's other areas where it's not doing well at all. So this is just another part of, helping to kind of go back to those old practices and potentially restore farmland and ranch land.
There's a quote in here that you used that I really liked, and this came from Lance Irving, who's the vice president of the Sand County Foundation, and he's talking about Brian Maddock in this, and he says, quote, he's not doing it for himself. He's thinking, how can I make it better for my kids? How can I make it better for my grandkids? And then Irving goes on to say, folks of his generation willing to change what they've done for the last 40, 50 years to try something new. It's not something you see all the time. And and that's the quote again from Lance Irving, who's the vice president of the Sand County Foundation. And and that really stood out to me because that is what this is, what these types of farming are doing is looking really generations ahead and taking care of the land for many generations.
Yeah, and if you go and look at the winners of, the past 10 years in North Dakota, and if you go and look at the ones from, South Dakota and I guess, 26 other states,
Hmm.
there's usually a picture of a lot of people. So it's like a big family that's running an enterprise, several generations of family that would like to stay on that land and use it essentially forever. I mean, I think that's what they said. They want to stay on that land forever and use it. When soil gets degraded to a point where you can't farm it very well anymore, that kind of throws your whole belief system about whether your family can use that land forever out of whack. So I think a lot of these people have kind of turned, and if you look at some of these other stories, a lot of them have turned to this out of necessity, and then once they've gotten into it, they've seen dramatic benefit of it, that they're, you know, they're often very, kind of evangelizing about these processes, which is interesting to see. And then you learn more about what they're doing, and then it goes back to, like what I said before, a lot of these practices were practices that had been done for many, many years before, that we just kind of got away from, with the I guess green revolution of agriculture in the 70s, the Norman Borlaug kind of explosion of agriculture. And, you know, I think that had its benefits, and it does have its benefits, but if the land gets to a point where it's degraded so much that you just have to keep adding inputs on it, it's like, okay, is that feasible for, 50, 100, 200 years down the line? So I think some of these people, have become true believers in what they're doing, and it's very interesting to see.
Yeah. So when we started out, you said that one of the reasons why you did this story was because it was an award that you hadn't heard of and you wanted to know more about it. So just looking at this, from a reporter side to kind of give our listeners a little bit more of an insight into what we do as reporters, it's really interesting when we come across something like this where we haven't heard about it, and we know that it's not really widely out there. Of course, a lot of the people involved in this industry will have heard of it, but not the general public. And it's really important to let the public know about things like this. So, what other
Yeah.
kind of things do you look for when you're finding stories?
Yeah, I mean, so for this one, when I was talking to people, I was like, well, how well known is this? Because I hadn't heard of it before. I knew Aldo Leopold. I hadn't really heard of the award. And they said, well, the people within the ranching community, especially the regenerative ranching community, of course, know about it, but not more widely. So, when I see something like that, it's like, okay, I think more people should know about this. That's kind of just a general reaction to that. So, I mean, a lot of the stories that we're doing, we're trying not to repeat too much of what other people are covering, because there's just not enough journalists here in North Dakota. So I try to look for things that, one, kind of interest me, two, might be an angle that people aren't really looking at, or just a topic it might not be newsy, but once people will look at it, or read the story, it is news because it's happening. These are things that are happening in our communities. It doesn't have to be tied to some, one specific happening. So I like stories like that are kind of, they look like they're almost kind of out of the blue. But I think right now people get so, I mean, I know I do, get fed up with kind of the news cycle and all the
Right.
everything's like, oh, it's tied to this, that you kind of want to see stories that are not tied to that news cycle now and then.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'll, when the timing's right, I'll dip into those kind of stories, and then some other times you do have to kind of follow the news cycle depending on what the story is. And this next story that I have coming is more in that line, but it's nice to do these other stories as well.
Yeah. I have to agree with you. Of course, you and I are both very much into the news, and we both spend a lot of time reading news and listening to news and watching news and all of that. And so it does get exhausting. And I have to think that even for people who aren't in the news industry themselves, who aren't tied to the news, every waking moment, still currently the news cycles gets exhausting. And so it's really nice once in a while to read these stories that talk about something great that's happening in your community, in your state, and how we are looking to the future, helping the earth for the future, feeding people, and just a really positive story. It is really nice to see those once in a while. Actually, I think it's nice to see those all the time. Unfortunately, we can't do them all the time. We do have to cover the other stuff too, but
Yep. Yeah, no, it's I mean, as a journalist, you kind of get burned out too on following the news cycle and just trying to keep up on what's going on, that you're like, sometimes you're like, okay, I just want to do something that's nobody's even thinking about too much.
yeah.
And I think readers like those stories because it kind of gets them out of their everyday news consumption as well, because they might be seeing everything's government shutdown right now, or federal cuts, or, this and that, Trump administration, whatever. So something that's, totally outside that is nice, and it's good as a reporter to do those stories and go out and visit those people, and then, do the other stories as well, which, have to be done. But
Yeah. But this time around, if you want a story that's not going to stress you out while you read it,
yes,
this is the
yes,
story for you.
definitely.
All right. And again, this story was titled on our website and in your community newspapers as Roots Matter for Award-Winning Regenerative Ranch Family. You can read that story on our website at newscoopnd.org or in one of our local newspaper partners. For the North Dakota News Cooperative, I'm Sabrina Halverson. This has been The Backstory.